Hey, I'm Jay Holland. Welcome back to our last episode of the week of Guided by Faith for this week. I hope it's been a blessing to you. And if so, please share it with a friend. Share it with your youth pastor if you don't go to our church so that they know it's a resource. Share it with your moms and dads so that they can get educated as well. Here we go. Last episode of the week. This week, we have spent the whole week looking at what I feel like are the most powerful evidences for the resurrection of Jesus. We've seen how the disciples and his enemies and even his brothers were transformed into believing that Jesus truly did rise from the dead. We've looked at the empty tomb, how neither friend nor foe could explain away what happened and that nobody could produce a body. And today we're going to zoom out and ask a final question. How do you explain the unstoppable advance of Christianity, the unstoppable rise of Christianity, especially in the first few hundred years? Now remember, Paul said in 1 Corinthians 15, if Christ has not been raised, then your faith is futile. But if Christ has indeed been raised from the dead, So if Christ hasn't been raised, then our faith is just garbage. Like, you shouldn't waste your time. But we believe that Christ has raised from the dead, and that one truth changed everything. So let's look at the numbers. I think this is pretty incredible. If you actually start the week before Jesus was crucified on Palm Sunday, when Jesus has the triumphal entry, it would appear that there's 2,000 to 3,000 maybe followers of Jesus who are lining the streets, laying their cloaks down, waving palm branches, praising him, saying, Hosanna, God save us, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, ready to crown and make him king. And then just a few days later, that's on Sunday, and by Thursday night, the disciples have all fled from him. And by Friday, Jesus is crucified. And so I think that we can safely say that by Friday night, Jesus has taken the thousands of fans or followers, and now we are down to 0 believers. There are people that loved him. There are people that really were devoted to him. But everybody had their dreams shattered. And so now we are down to 0 true believers that he really was the Son of God, that he, they thought he was going to be the Messiah, and they're now wrestling through how can this have happened? So that's on Thursday, on Friday. On Saturday, we're still at 0 believers. On Sunday, Jesus rises from the dead and he begins to appear to people. And so that first Sunday, through his appearances that we see in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, it would seem that Jesus appeared to 10 to 20 people. So let's say that from Friday night to Sunday morning, we go from 0 to 10 to 20 believers. Then over the next 40 days, scripture tells us, especially in 1 Corinthians 15, that Jesus appears to about 500 people. So 40 days after Jesus' death, we go from 0 to 500 believers. And then Jesus rises back into heaven. 10 days later, Pentecost happens, and Peter preaches the first sermon on the day of Pentecost. And scripture tells us that at the end of that sermon, there are now 3,000 baptized believers that are convinced that Jesus has risen from the dead and that he truly is the Son of God. That's pretty powerful in a 50-day span to go from 0 to 20 to 500 to 3,000. Soon after, Acts 4 records that the number had grown to 5,000 men alone. That doesn't include women and children. So probably we're looking at 7,000 to 10,000 total people just weeks to months after Jesus' death. Now, we have to fast forward and we start to look at historical sources after that. And so now our numbers kind of really fluctuate depending on what sources you're looking at. By the end of the first century, different historians estimate the number of Christians ranged from anywhere from 7,000 to 50 or even 100,000 scattered in 3 continents, in Europe, in Asia, and in North Africa. Interestingly, even India at this point has believers, because doubting Thomas, after he believed, gave his life to go to South India and begin to share the gospel. And there are churches in South India today, 2,000 years later, that claim direct line and descendants from Thomas. One of the most popular Christian last names in India is Thomas, after the Apostle Thomas. I have good friends, very good friends, whose last name is Thomas. So by the end of, the end of AD 100, that's 70 years after Jesus' resurrection, you have up to maybe 100,000 believers. Now, 200 years later, by AD 300, that number has exploded to around 6 million. And what's really crazy about this is you are talking about a time that there is zero Christian political power, zero Christian armies, zero real Christian resources and riches in the world, and yet a ton of persecution, And in spite of all of this, with no conquering army, no like crusades to overcome a city, you have around 6 million believers. And by AD 350, estimates go as high as 30 million believers, nearly half of the Roman Empire. So as the Roman Empire, with all of its power, prestige, might, money, and armies, is crumbling, this ragtag group of people who had no power, no prestige, no real money, no army or anything like that, now number about half of the Roman Empire. And this message wasn't spread by armies. It wasn't driven by money. It wasn't driven by political power. And the social influence they had is because of the radical way that they lived their life. They were willing to take in people sick with the plague into their house and nurse them, even though they knew they were going to get the plague and die. Romans would throw their babies out in the streets when they didn't want to have them anymore. And Christians would go along and take those babies, bring them into their house, adopt them, and care and transfer them. So the social influence they had is they lived so radically compared to everybody else. Now, how would you explain this? Well, if this was a movement of ordinary people, it would have been squashed a long time ago. The persecutions would have killed it as thousands and thousands of Christians were killed, were murdered. Some of them were fed to lions. They were used as sport in the Roman gladiator arenas. But instead, it kept spreading and kept spreading and kept spreading. And today, there are 2 billion people that would claim to be Christian. I don't believe they're all Christian, but that's pretty impressive to go from 0 to 2 billion, at least claiming to be Christian. But let's look back at that the launch of the church. There is no way to explain the launch of the church unless Jesus has really risen from the dead. They didn't get comfort. They didn't get safety. They got beatings, imprisonments, and martyrdom. And yet they couldn't stop talking about Jesus. The same Peter who denied Jesus 3 times was the man who stood in front of thousands and said, God has raised this Jesus to life, and we are all witnesses of it. This declaration echoed through Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and now what's interesting is we, if you're in the Western United States, we're the ends of the earth. And now we're taking the gospel back around the world to the unreached parts. Why? Because the resurrection of Jesus truly happened. Jesus told Thomas, blessed are you because you have seen me, but man, how blessed are those who, even though they've never seen me, they've never touched me, yet they still believe. And so I love closing out this week, reminding you that if you believe in the resurrection, Jesus says you are especially blessed, like you are an object of God's favor, because in faith, you believe the evidence before you that's true. And I pray that it changes your life. Hey, this has been really fun. Now, next week, I have something really special for you. We are going to look at the evidence of the resurrection based on the massively transformed lives and cultures. I'm going to tell you some incredible stories that will encourage your faith. But for this weekend, I hope you meditate on what we've talked about, that it encourages you. You share it with a friend. Have a great weekend. I look forward to talking to you next week.